As I was saying, definitely you want to look at socialization, how society is constructed, because essentially all the institutions we are talking about, whether it's the political party themselves, government, any other agencies, they take in the social construction of society. And because we live in a patriarchal world, where we have by default men have an advantage, right, to be in leadership, to access and control resources, we find that it is that same group of people who are men who they are the founders of political parties. And even where they have not been founders of political parties, and I'll get to that, they are in leadership positions. So there is a big aspect of looking at how we transform our social construction and our societies in order for young women to be able to join political parties, participate in political parties meaningfully, and also be able to sit in positions of leadership. We can start off with the idea of participation. A lot of parties will say, well, we have a youth league. But if you look at the youth league, it is constructed the way society is. So most likely the youth league leader is a young man. And young women, because of socialization, are probably not in the leadership position. And if they are, then their agenda as young women is also not the main agenda on the table. So again, there's need for deliberate measures to ensure that they are meaningfully participating in those spaces. There is also this idea of waithood, which has been well discussed by Alcinda. I forget her surname, but she's an African. She's an African author from Mozambique. I think she's now established in the UK. And a big agenda of young people is that waithood. And of course, it manifests differently both for young men and young women. Starting off, then, if you go back to socialization, you recognize that the issue of mobility, right? If you're talking about mobility through society, historically and to the present, it's young men and men that have that readiness, and young women and women do not have that mobility. Here we can talk about financial mobility, we can talk about mobility of the bodies. So that also plays into in what ways are young people participating in political parties, in political processes, and in society. So how does that look like in reality? This looks like a young man is able to stay after school and join student politics. This is already at primary level, right? They might or they are attending sports games after school and all of that, and they're gaining social capital. Because it is the same social capital that you carry on into the rest of your life. A young woman might be at home either because there are restrictions in her movement, even if she's advantaged economically, so she lives in a gated community, fair enough. But then that restricts her movement. She's not getting a social capital. If it's in context like Malawi and quite a bit of most of the countries in sub-Saharan region of Africa, they are probably doing house chores in the afternoon. So your social mobility, who you're organizing with, who ideas that you're collecting are already limited to sort of domestic work, the private space. And young men and boys are already, kind of in the public arena or engaging in that. This also has a good bearing on the idea of access to ideas and information, and maybe I should speak more information. So comes in the issues of access to radios. That's what was being spoken of before digitalization took over the world, and now you can talk about access to mobile phones. And then what do you have access to? What do you have access to online as well? A colleague of mine has shared, she did a study and they realized that they were now working with young women in universities, and realized that if you look at the media that young women are consuming online, it's in many ways different from the media that young men are consuming online. Not only that, algorithms, remember, are fed by our behaviors, or they are built based on our behaviors. So as we Google, the latest shade of a MAC lipstick and all of that feeds into the algorithm. And when we register on Twitter, which is X now, or when you register on Facebook or TikTok, and you say you're female or male, the algorithm will say certain kind of information your way. Right? This is layered up with our hobbies and all of that, which it actually most of these platforms do us. Now, fast forward, we are now looking at the political party, and we have 2-3 categories of people in that political party. We have those that are coming to the idea of politics, sort of, because how do I want to place this? So they are coming to politics because they're now, a little older, right? At whatever age they are, and they're interested in engaging, or because of what's happening in their country, they need to engage one way or the other, right? And I would say that a lot of young people start engaging in political aspects or agency or the public arena of life because of the experiences, either on their personhood, on their society, or what they see at large, right? And that's why we say the personal is political and the political is person. There are a lot of things that inform our engagement. That comes now, democracy and representation of democracy. I must have a platform for engaging, and that's why the political party becomes an important platform and tool for engagement. And therefore, you need to adopt, or you need to be a member of a political party. This does not necessarily mean then that these political parties represent the ideologies, the aspirations for young people. This does not necessarily mean that those political parties are structured in a way that they can meaningfully participate. However, they recognize the importance of this. And once in the political party, as I said, and I began with, was that the structure of the society plays out there. So that structure is a hierarchy of identities. You have the patrons or the patriarchs, who are usually men, who had an advantage of entry into the space as young people. A lot of them started off their political careers as liberators. They were quite young. However, a narrative then comes up about how we are more experienced and we know what needs to be done, or you need to respect your seniors, forgetting that they started off at a particular age. And then, of course, with time, we've had a lot more inclusion of women into the space. So that would probably be the second category of folk. But you still notice in most political parties and countries that the young men in political leadership have more mobility. That could be mobility across parties, mobility across roles. They would even maybe be able to run two careers, if you like. They might be both in civic engagement and in political leadership. And women and their own women are burdened with so many things. They are burdened with stereotypes. They are burdened with sexism. They are burdened with sexual harassment that is happening in that party, besides what is happening outside the home. They are burdened by gender roles. The gender roles do not stop. Whether you have a child or not, whether you're married or not, those become a thing. They play out in different ways. And in the political party, this looks like the Women League, Ladies League. The Women League being relegated to gender essentialist roles, so you're serving tea. In some of their countries, that's where they organize the dances and the care roles, and not necessarily the decisions around how we're going to use the fund that come from the government to facilitate party politics, right? Where is the money? Who has the money? How is being organized? A lot of women and youth leagues do not actually get enough grants to be able to strengthen their bases as constituencies, but also for the individuals that make up those constituencies, right? Capacity strengthening and all of that. The young woman is sitting at this intersection. She's sitting at the intersection of the identity of a young person. So ageism comes in, right? You're not experienced, you do not know enough. And then you are in, besides all the other things that we have already mentioned, that is the lived reality there. So what could make political parties work? I will share examples. There is the example of the quota system, which we know very well. I think, for example, in Uganda, I know that women leads have partnered with few leagues to advance for policies, right, that make first the policies that are gender responsive and even gender transformative at political party level. So this can look like adoption of gender policies, a robust gender policy. What would our party look like, or what should our party do in order to ensure that women and young women are participating fully in this party? So you outline that. And a gender policy isn't just sexual harassment policy. That's another one. How are we going to address sexual harassment, not just in the political party, but then, for example, during campaign periods, etc. Some of them, young people, with once they've had enough
not once they've had enough training. A lot of times we actually understand what needs to be done. It's then articulating what are the solutions we need. So they, for example, lobbied for increase in the percentage of the funding that goes to the youth leagues, that goes to the women leagues, recognizing that they live at the intersection of those two groups and those lived realities. They have also then introduced women desks, right? So that the issues, whatever is the issue, topical issue of discussion or issue at hand, they're able to address it from that desk as well and make recommendations into the political party. I think one last recommendation that I think is interesting for me is also the young women recognizing that they need to take up leadership roles. So that has looked like just deciding that they're going to chair meetings within the political, well, meetings, for example, when it's a meeting in the youth league, and if it's with the women league, then to seek out or cultivate robust leadership relationships, so that they are also learning from those that are more experienced in the women's space. These are some of the things that political parties can very easily institutionalize, besides, of course, policies on how they're going to address violence against women in politics. The violence that we talk about is usually the physical violence and not the systematic and structural violence that is allowed and normalized within the political structure, but also our respective societies. I mean, personal development is a whole program, right? People go through it either as leaders, young people, even people in executive leadership still need personal development. But the gist of it is the fact that development is continual, or learning is continual, and the personal is political, right? So in as much as then you understand, you have, for example, a political party manifesto. That is the manifesto of your party. And the country has its own strategies, running from health to education, to many other things, right? And so you need to identify, what is my offering to the world? Now, your offering to the world, in as good as it may be, it needs an entry point. And the idea then there is that you will meet challenges. And in the midst of that storm, you need to be able to remember, or to have your bearing of why am I doing what I am doing. And your purpose might change, it might shift, but it needs to have a starting off point, because that's how then you review it and go forward. So the person is political. It means that in as much as you can have a manifesto for the political party, which is really the aspiration of how they think their community or the nation needs to be served, it's the aspiration of what they would like to do for their country or their nation, is what you also ought to be able to identify for yourself. And it's not necessarily that all people, right, their manifesto is outward looking. There are quite a number of people whose manifesto is inward looking. So for example, and most of those people are not in public leadership. But as long as you're in a public leadership role, or you're going to engage with the world, you should ideally have your what is my plan? What am I trying to do? So the separation of the two is very important, particularly for women, because we are not brought up in a society that tells us that we can actually have an individual vision, or that we can, or does not prepare us very well for leadership. And it's a good practice. I think in the African context, we talk about I am because we are. But the political arena, especially representation democracy, is quite competitive. And also patriarchal leadership is competitive, right? So the patriarchal leadership is kind of is structured around, I am the apex of this process. How do I place myself forward? And you're not necessarily thinking in that way. So you ought to define, what is my personal development plan? It's for you as a person, because you are a person beyond the party, right? And your party might fail, or things might change, and you need to have a bearing for how you come back to it. Who are you, and what is your offering to the world, if you would like to make an offering? Then there is the political party offering, which is the manifesto itself. But another and maybe more important reason for why you need this personal development plan or manifesto, besides the political party manifesto, is the fact that you need to figure out, where can I best make an offering, or how best can I do this? Which are your strengths? What opportunities are there for me to do this? Which are your entry points? And then what are the things that could possibly prove as a challenge? Your weaknesses and your threats. Because then you know the areas either you need support in or that you need to manage so that they don't become an impediment to your strengths and the opportunity that you have identified. And as I shared in the session, in many ways, I think this is what it comes down to in terms of political navigation or navigating the political landscape. I think this is a tool or lens that young men, boys kind of adopt very quickly. And this is done through the games that we play, right? If your games are family, you're playing house, you're playing how to collaborate. Somebody's playing football, video games, shooting. They're planning on how do I keep myself agent. So it's a lens that we don't necessarily grow, and is not our default to carry forward, to assess in this particular situation what's the best way forward that will keep me in the space. And so that personal development is something that you do and is encouraged that you do with others, because you recognize that you need to transform this way of operating. So it helps you to identify what support system do I have? Do I need psychosocial support? What am I going to do to feed myself? How do I make sure I am still inspired? I do not become cynical. So that's what happens to a lot of people that have degradation. And that personal development plan or manifesto must evolve. We are currently in unprecedented times. It's in some ways we are seeing the far rights. The far rights movement is growing. Fascism is growing. There's a right to gender rights movement. You need to go back to the drawing board and say, where am I in this, and how am I going to survive this time? Not for your sake, but for the sake of the constituency and the aid of the world. That's exactly what political parties are doing. Every time we meet in our political party, that's what we're doing. We're assessing what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, how we're going to deal with the opposition, which is your threat. And a lot of young women, a lot of young people, a lot of women are involved in that process because they are the mobilizers, right? They are the mobilizers. They are the trusted persons in their communities, and they're doing that for the VRO, which they operate for. But they're not doing enough of that for themselves. And that's where I was trying to differentiate them to. Like, as we do this for the political party and actively participate, it's also important that they do that for ourselves. So a political party meeting might end it. Okay, so now we need to go mobilize in this particular constituency because we are losing supporters in that area. Or it looks like that constituency has become interested in what is happening in the politics of the day. We need to get into partnership with them, whether it's the private sector, whether it's some business guru, or whether it's some religious community. But that's what political parties are constantly doing. As an individual, there is an aspect of that. But I want to finish this off with the fact that I am feminist, and I do approach this from that perspective. So it's not necessarily then to build soulless public leaders and specifically political leaders. The idea is not that young people and young women should become that, but that we must recognize that as people, there is a lot of room for growth, right? And so we should, the same emphasis and the same effort that is put into growing political parties, into growing the young people's constituency, the women's constituency, is something that we can do for ourselves. And obviously, as a person, you have different aspects to yourself. You have your health, you have your physical well-being, you have your mindset, right? What do you know? What are you open to? What are you not open to? Because all of these things can prove to be impediments in how you perform in the public arena, and more specifically in the leadership journey. I think there are many ways to transform that narrative. Firstly is that we should dispute that narrative. Women are involved in the political process at so many points. And I would say they are involved in what are considered to be the informal processes. So think about when somebody goes to a community and they say they want to contest. It's not only the young men or the people we see running around. There are a lot of women that are involved in that. And in some countries, they have taken an effort to document that. And that's why I mentioned, for example, the docu-film that was developed by Badili Africa in Kenya, where they're trying to document that particular process. But when we go into our respective communities of food, I think of any campaign It might be the fact that somebody just say, I was born in this community, or this is my mother, or this is my grandmother. They don't only mention their lineage from their father's side. That's the most basic way. It might be that they might be taken with a picture greeting some woman in the community, and those people are chosen deliberately because they are opinion leaders, because people trust them, other than the fact that women are actively involved in mobilization. We know that in terms of campaigns, and especially when we're in a context of build up to elections, for example, women in the markets, women in so many spaces are speaking and campaigning on behalf of political parties and political individuals as well. But then there's also the aspect of political parties are not built in a vacuum. They need information. So a lot of the informers involved in those processes, the thinking, the strategizing, the positioning, involves both lean and weak. However, all these roles, when it now comes to the sharing of the cake, which honestly shouldn't be that, but then when positions are being put out, then all of a sudden women are asked to justify why they should be in a place of leadership, or the question of where are the qualified women? We need a list of the qualified women. And yet up to that point, they were able to identify the women they needed either to contest and all of that. And so one way to do that is just to really dispute the narrative, shift the narrative, and say, actually, these are the concrete examples of how women have been involved in these processes, right? And so documentation is a big aspect of it. But other than documentation is then discussing it. And I think, for example, in the training today, we had young women sharing their experiences and how they worked, and some of them how the question of their marital status was not asked when they were building a constituency and all of that. But we don't do enough of actually then actively sharing those stories. Then another step is not to be deliberate about supporting the women that are sitting in positions. And maybe this is where media comes in, like an active actor that can do that, media actors themselves. This looks like, instead of media plays a huge role in maintaining the narrative, either the stereotypes, the sexism, for most countries and most contexts, or at most times, let's not generalize, stories around women might be more around their appearance, might be more about how they engage, their reaction to a particular issue, as opposed to the content itself. And that their stories are not followed consistently. They are followed for the sake of sensationalism, right? Because you want to sensationalize a particular narrative about women, either as victims or as a reactive person, right? And yet there's so much work that women are doing in their different. And when I say constituency, I'm really talking about, even if you're sitting at a regional platform, there's a constituency that you're working with. So the constituency could be a regional constituency. So within the African Union, I would go to that extent. Those are political appointments, some of them. They're stories of their contribution to the world, to advancing, conventions that are not necessarily only for women's rights agenda, but some of them really for the liberation of the world or making things better. For example, even around the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, if I was to speak to the African context, those stories are not shared, right? Their technical expertise is not shared. Referencing of documents, whether it's policy briefs, if we look at them, by default, it might be that it is a fact that not might be, it is a fact that unless there's a deliberate instruction, it is men's work that is referenced. All that invisibilizes women's voices. All that invisibilizes women's thought leadership. All that invisibilizes or infantilizes women to people that must be spoken to, that must be managed, that must be organized, because they cannot do that for themselves. And yet women are sitting at different tables besides our national politics and speaking to policy-making processes, advising on policy-making processes, leading policy-making processes, and those are not shared. So narrative can change through 1, documentation, 2, not documentation and being left on the shelf, but then those must be spoken and shared. Media plays a huge role, but I realize also as people that develop knowledge products, it's important that we're being deliberate about who we are referencing, who we are interviewing, and who we are also asking to lead in different processes, whether it's an inquiry process as a research. All of that can feed into changing the narrative of where are the women, where are the qualified women, and whether women and young women especially can do this. I would like to close with some of the examples that I shared. I mentioned, for example, Honorable Anadeke of Uganda, who was one of the youngest women to make it into parliament in Uganda, and that has changed the narrative because we've had other young women there. I would want to speak of, I hope I'm not getting the country wrong, I mean you can correct it afterward, but I think there's a young woman minister in Botswana as well. I forget her age, at which point she got in. Those narratives are not shared enough just to demonstrate the capacities of so quote unquote young people. And it's to come back to this narrative again specifically, then that's got to do with the young people. The narrative of women plus the fact of being young is what is imposed on young people, on young women specifically, and what they're capable of doing. And both of those narratives need to be debunked, of what it means to be a woman and of what it means to be young as well.